Mark and Susan Dawson thought they had the perfect life until their daughter Emily vanished on prom night without a trace. For 5 agonizing years, they begged for answers, clung to hope, and mourned in silence. But when Emily's body was discovered in a remote forest, buried in her prom dress, the town's sympathy turned to suspicion. In a stunning twist, the grieving father who once led search parties became the prime suspect in her murder, uncovering secrets far darker than anyone imagined. Mark waited downstairs with a camera in hand, eager to get photos before Emily left. She came down the stairs smiling, her dress flowing around her like water. Mark snapped dozens of pictures in the front yard. Emily laughing, holding a small bouquet, posing beside their family car. They mingled with friends, danced under the colored lights, and posed for photos in the decorated photo booth. According to Tyler, they had planned to attend an after-party at a classmate's farmhouse on the edge of town. But Emily changed her mind during the drive. Tyler later told police that halfway there, she asked him to pull over at a gas station and let her out. She claimed she didn't feel like going to the party and said she had arranged another ride home. Multiple classmates remembered seeing her smiling and laughing. She didn't appear upset or anxious. Social media posts from that evening showed her having a good time, hugging friends, twirling on the dance floor, and smiling beside Tyler. Security footage from the station's broken camera had not worked in over a year. Classmates wore blue ribbons during graduation, and teachers shared memories of a bright, kind-hearted girl. The community rallied behind the Dawsons. News outlets covered the story for weeks. But as days turned into months and months into years, the attention slowly faded. There were no witnesses who could confirm seeing her there. He had no scratches, no strange behavior, and he passed a drug test voluntarily. Police found nothing suspicious on his phone or in his car. His friends at the after-party confirmed he was there by 10:30 p.m., and photos taken at the event backed up the timeline. The area was remote, miles from any trail. The fabric looked old, weather-worn, and oddly familiar. The hiker reported it to the park rangers, who contacted police. Their marriage, once stable, showed signs of strain. The dental records confirmed what everyone had feared for years. Emily's empty room remained untouched, like a memorial frozen in time. Eventually, he was cleared as a suspect. From that point on, Emily disappeared without a trace. No one reported picking her up. No Uber or taxi records matched the area. Investigators theorized she may have lied to Tyler, planning to meet someone else. Some suggested she ran away, others feared she had been abducted. But with no physical evidence, the case became stagnant. Every possible lead ended in disappointment. The Dawsons were left with grief, frustration, and endless questions. She looked like she had stepped out of a fairy tale. They held press conferences, ran social media pages, and worked closely with missing persons organizations. Mark, in particular, became the face of the family's fight. He was seen at every event, handing out flyers, talking to reporters, and organizing community search efforts. His determination made him a symbol of hope, a father who refused to give up. May 18, 2018 began like any other warm spring day in Greenwood, Indiana. He was wearing a navy suit and a matching tie. Tyler and Emily had been dating for about a year. But the bed was untouched. Emily's overnight bag still sat by the dresser. By noon, they contacted police. No one remembered seeing Emily after 10:15 p.m. Her phone last pinged at 10:34 p.m. on the outskirts of town before shutting off completely. That location, a stretch of rural road between Greenwood and the nearby forest, raised concern. There were no houses, no stores, just trees and farmland. Search teams were organized, but no immediate clues turned up. Her phone was off, and her shoes from the night before were missing. He was polite, quiet, and always respectful around her parents. The two left in his car around 7 o'clock p.m. to attend the prom being held in the school gymnasium. Birds chirped, the sun shone down on the quiet suburban streets, and high school students all across town buzzed with excitement. She lived with her parents, Mark and Susan Dawson, in a 2-story house on Evergreen Drive. Their neighborhood was peaceful, the kind where people waved when they mowed lawns and kids rode bikes until sunset. The Dawsons were well known. Mark worked at a car dealership, and Susan was a nurse at the local clinic. Emily, a senior, was known for her good grades, polite manners, and close group of friends. She wasn't wild, didn't party too much, and mostly stayed out of trouble. It was prom night at Greenwood Central High School, and for 17-year-old Emily Dawson, it was a night she had been planning for months. Her sky blue gown had been hanging in the closet for weeks. Her silver heels were still in their box. Everything had to be perfect. Emily was an only child. That afternoon, Susan helped Emily curl her hair and apply a touch of makeup. By 6:45 p.m., her date, Tyler Jenkins, arrived to pick her up. What happened over the next few hours would become the subject of years of investigation, countless interviews, and endless speculation. Emily and Tyler were seen entering the prom venue at around 7:30 p.m., around 10:15 p.m. Emily and Tyler reportedly left the school gym. That's where things began to unravel. Tyler said he dropped her off at the old Shell station on Orchard Road. It was a quiet area, surrounded by fields and a few industrial buildings. The next morning, Susan walked into her daughter's room, expecting to see a sleeping teenager still exhausted from a night of dancing. Panic set in quickly. Susan called Tyler, who repeated the story about the gas station. Mark drove around town, checking familiar places. Officers began canvassing the area. They checked the school gym, the farmhouse party, and the gas station. Posters with Emily's face flooded social media and telephone poles. Vigils were held, candlelit prayers filled church halls. Despite exhaustive efforts, there were no solid leads. Tyler was questioned repeatedly. He provided the same story each time. The gas station remained a frustrating dead end. No other students or adults remembered seeing Emily there. Mark and Susan did everything they could to keep the investigation alive, but behind the scenes, the family struggled. Susan withdrew from her job, and the couple began attending counseling. By the third year, the case was officially declared cold. Evidence had dried up. Witnesses had nothing new to say. Then 5 years later, something changed. A hiker wandering through the woods of Muscatatuck National Wildlife Refuge stumbled across a torn piece of blue fabric stuck to a fallen log. Within a week, search dogs found human remains buried beneath a shallow patch of earth just 20 yards from where the fabric had been discovered. Emily Dawson had been found, but now it was no longer a question of where she had gone. It was a question of who had put her there. The discovery of Emily Dawson's remains brought a jarring end to 5 years of silence. What had once been a missing persons case was now a homicide investigation. The blue fabric found nearby matched Emily's prom dress, confirming she had been buried in what she was last seen wearing. Further testing revealed blunt force trauma to the skull. The blow had been hard and deliberate, strong enough to cause death. There were no signs of defensive wounds, no signs of sexual assault, and no personal belongings nearby. Her phone, jewelry, and shoes were missing. The shallow grave in Muscatatuck National Wildlife Refuge, over 40 miles from Greenwood, became the focal point of renewed interest and deep suspicion. Guests at the after-party recalled seeing him shortly after 10:30 p.m., drinking soda and playing music. One friend recalled Emily acting unusually quiet the week of prom. She seemed distracted and nervous, and at one point hinted she might skip the dance altogether. For 5 years, the Dawsons had appeared to be a united, grieving family. But behind the surface, there were cracks. Though aged and partially destroyed by weather, forensic experts managed to confirm that the pattern was consistent with a make and model of truck, specifically a Ford F-150 from the early 2000s. Mark Dawson owned such a vehicle at the time. Mark had once owned a hunting license for that region. Why had Mark claimed to be home asleep during those hours when his phone data told a different story? Cell tower data from 2018 showed a brief, unexplained signal from his work-issued phone in an area near Muscatatuck the night Emily disappeared. The sample had never been matched to anything conclusive at the time. But now, with the burial site exposed, a comparison was possible. The sender claimed they had overheard Mark Dawson yelling at Emily days before prom. According to the tip, the argument was about a secret, something Emily had discovered and was threatening to reveal. In a locked toolbox in the garage, they found something chilling, a gold locket with Emily's initials engraved on it. It matched the one she had worn in the pre-prom photos. It had never been recovered with her body. Investigators questioned why Mark had it, hidden away in a place only he could access. The tipster didn't offer further detail or proof, but the claim added another layer to the story. They theorized that she returned home after prom, or was intercepted before getting far and was driven to the woods by someone she trusted, someone who knew how to avoid cameras, someone who had reason to make sure she never spoke again. The soil from his truck matched the composition of the soil found around Emily S. grave, a specific blend of clay, decaying pine and mineral content unique to that part of the forest. Though not exact, the signal placed him within 5 miles of where Emily's body was later discovered. They weren't ready to arrest him, but he was no longer seen as a grieving father. He was now a person of interest. Neighbors described a household that had become tense and distant in the months leading up to Emily's disappearance. One neighbor reported hearing raised voices from the Dawson house late at night, often between Mark and Emily. Another said Emily had once come to their door, crying, and asked to use the phone. When asked why, Emily reportedly said something cryptic, that she didn't feel safe going. But she never explained further. Photos and videos from that night showed him present and relaxed. They discovered encrypted folders containing personal messages between Mark and an unidentified woman. The messages referenced financial payments, secrecy, and a fear of someone finding out. While investigators couldn't directly link the woman to Emily's death, it became clear that Mark had been hiding something from his family. No one saw Emily again after she supposedly exited his car. The gas station's cameras had never worked, and no other surveillance captured Emily on foot or getting into another vehicle. Her trail went cold at that gas station, but the body being found miles away suggested someone picked her up or intercepted her after Tyler drove off. It was remote, rarely visited, and covered in thick trees and underbrush. Whoever buried Emily there knew the land or had taken the time to find a place far from public access. She didn't know who the man was, but said Emily appeared angry and scared. Police asked for vehicle descriptions and pulled traffic cam footage, but nothing definitive surfaced. Investigators began re-examining every statement, every detail, every inch of the original file. Emily had not run away. She hadn't disappeared on her own terms. She had been killed, and someone had hidden her body with the hope it would never be found. Forensic teams worked around the clock. The body, though partially decomposed, was identified through dental records. The location of the body raised difficult questions. Muscatutuck was not a place people stumbled across. Emily's parents were informed immediately. Susan collapsed upon hearing the news. Mark, though visibly shaken, appeared composed. He asked to be left alone and refused media interviews for days. The town of Greenwood mourned again. News vans returned and headlines splashed across screens. Emily Dawson found after 5 years. Prom night mystery now a murder case. New life for cold case investigation. Detectives focused first on the last person known to have seen Emily alive, Tyler Jenkins. He had since moved to Ohio, working construction and living with his new girlfriend. Police contacted him and requested a formal interview. Tyler cooperated, providing the same story he had 5 years earlier. He claimed he drove Emily to the gas station on Orchard Road after she asked to be let out. He thought she seemed tired, maybe overwhelmed, but not afraid. He assumed she had called a friend or ordered a ride. Tyler's alibi once again held up. Investigators broadened their scope. They re-interviewed Emily's friends and classmates. Another classmate claimed to have seen Emily arguing with a man in a black truck 2 days before prom. At the same time, they began looking more closely at her home life. Investigators revisited the crime scene and found tire tracks faintly preserved in the soil near the burial site. This discovery shifted the investigation in a dramatic direction. Police quietly began monitoring Mark. They dug into his records, his behavior, and anything that could tie him to the burial site. What they found surprised them. More questions followed. Why hadn't this detail come up earlier? Then came another discovery. Forensics experts combing through items collected back in 2018 re-examined soil samples taken from the wheel wells of Mark S. truck. Investigators now had circumstantial evidence tying Mark Dawson to the location where Emily had been buried. Around this time, an anonymous tip was submitted through the police department's website. Detectives began reviewing Mark's digital footprint, emails, deleted files, private accounts, and hard drives. A search warrant was issued. Police entered the Dawson home and thoroughly examined the garage, basement, attic, and shed. With mounting evidence, detectives began building a timeline that suggested Emily never made it to the gas station at all. The investigation was no longer a hunt for a stranger. It was a search for the truth hiding within her own home. As the investigation deepened, the image of Mark Dawson, the heartbroken father tirelessly searching for his missing daughter, began to fracture. The locket found in his garage raised far more questions than it answered. Why had he kept it hidden for 5 years? Why hadn't he turned it in when it was such a critical clue? He said he watched television, then went to bed around 11 p.m. His wife, Susan, had fallen asleep earlier. His truck had remained in the driveway, he claimed, unused and parked. Emily's body had been found without any jewelry, and this small detail, easily overlooked, now stood at the center of the investigation. To detectives, it was no longer a keepsake from a grieving parent, it was evidence. The years had not been kind to her. Grief had hollowed her voice, and her eyes carried the weight of exhaustion. She had never suspected Mark before. He quickly shut a cabinet and claimed he was just reorganizing his tools. She hadn't thought much of it then, but now the memory seemed heavy with new meaning. Possibly a secret Mark had kept hidden from the family, one that could ruin his marriage, his job, or his reputation. Emily, being emotional and impulsive, may have threatened to reveal the truth. Perhaps Mark feared that exposure more than anything else. She had stood beside him through every press conference, every tearful interview, believing he shared in her pain. Police kept a tight lid on developments to prevent media frenzy. Mark continued his daily routines as if nothing had changed, even returning to local advocacy work for missing children. But detectives kept him under surveillance, noting every movement, every place he visited, and every conversation he had in public. But when confronted with the recent findings, Susan grew quiet. She admitted something she hadn't shared before. Investigators returned to the timeline of the night Emily disappeared. Though degraded, there was enough to confirm it likely belonged to her, and none of it should have been there if Mark S.'s story were true. Tyler Jenkins maintained his original story, and surveillance from the party venue still placed him there within minutes of dropping Emily off if he ever really did. Emily's discovery of his secret whatever that might have been was the motive. What remained was a far darker truth, a man who, according to investigators, had sacrificed his own daughter to protect a life built on lies. Her attempt to expose him was the spark, and the evidence, both physical and circumstantial, told a story that was impossible to ignore. They secured a warrant and arrested Mark Dawson at his home on a quiet Tuesday morning in May 2023, 5 years almost to the day since Emily had gone missing. She filed for divorce and publicly stated she had no prior knowledge of Mark's actions. Mark had attended fundraisers, helped organize search parties, and even joined grief support groups for other parents of missing children. All while knowing, prosecutors now alleged, that he had been responsible. Her statements to police were consistent with someone blindsided by the arrest. She cooperated with the investigation, expressing disbelief and sorrow over what had happened under her own roof. The town was stunned. News reports called it a betrayal of the worst kind of father accused of killing his own daughter. One evening, she overheard Emily shouting at Mark from behind her bedroom door. Buried in a locked drawer in his office were handwritten pages that read like a confession, though vague in nature. Mark had written about feeling cornered, about being found out, and about doing what had to be done. He never named Emily or the crime, but the timing and tone of the journal were hard to ignore. The entry stopped abruptly in May 2018. Susan couldn't make out what it was about, only that Emily sounded upset and Mark's voice was low and calm, eerily so. Though it had been cleaned multiple times since Emily's disappearance, new technology allowed for deeper residue detection. Under the lining of the bed, traces of blood proteins were discovered too degraded for conclusive DNA at first, but enough to send for advanced testing. While the lab results were pending, the circumstantial evidence was already overwhelming. When Emily emerged, she didn't speak to her mother and avoided eye contact. That was 3 days before she vanished. But what if Emily had never reached the gas station? That possibility grew more likely as gaps began to show in Mark's own account. In 2018, when Emily went missing, Mark told police he had stayed home the entire night. The ping lasted only a minute before the phone was shut off. At the time, this small blip had been dismissed due to imprecise data and the assumption that nothing suspicious tied Mark to the area. But now, paired with the soil from his truck and the locket in his garage, it became a critical piece of the puzzle. But cell phone data painted a different picture. On May 16th, just 2 days before Emily vanished, Mark purchased a tarp, zip ties, a flashlight, and a pair of heavy-duty gloves from a local hardware store. The transaction had gone unnoticed for years because it had been made with cash, and the receipt never flagged any attention. But the store had kept surveillance footage, archived in a digital database, and when investigators requested footage from that date, they confirmed it was Mark at the register. Phone records revealed that Mark's work-issued device briefly connected to a tower east of Greenwood at 10:46 p.m. that night, now known to be just a few miles from the forest where Emily was buried. Police retrieved financial records from the week of the prom. As detectives dug further, they began speaking again with Susan Dawson. A few days before prom, she said, she had come home early from work to find Mark in the garage, startled and sweating. Susan also revealed that Emily and Mark had been fighting frequently that spring. Emily had grown more distant and confrontational. As the pieces came together, investigators developed a theory. Emily had discovered something. Forensic analysts returned to the truck that had sat in the Dawsons' driveway for years. Behind closed doors, prosecutors began preparing their case. Publicly, nothing was announced. Then came the final blow. The DNA results from the blood sample in the truck bed came back, a partial match to Emily Dawson. Investigators moved swiftly. During the search following his arrest, detectives found even more damning evidence. Susan Dawson moved out of the family home days later. As news of the arrest spread, people across Greenwood reflected on what they thought they knew. His trial was scheduled for later that year. The charge was first-degree murder, and the prosecution planned to argue that the crime had been premeditated. Mark Dawson's image as a devoted father had been shattered. The courtroom was packed on the first day of the trial. Reporters filled the back rows while townspeople lined up outside, waiting for a glimpse of the man who had once stood at the center of the community's grief. This was a cold, calculated act. They laid out their timeline, evidence, and motive with chilling precision. Emily Dawson had learned something about her father, something he didn't want getting out. There was Mark, 2 days before Emily vanished, purchasing items used in outdoor cleanup and concealment, a tarp, gloves, zip ties, and a flashlight. She told the court about the argument between Emily and Mark in the days leading up to prom. Mark had been having an affair with a former co-worker. Their communication had been ongoing for more than 2 years. Emily had found out, prosecutors claimed, and threatened to tell her mother. This wasn't just a simple betrayal of marriage, it was tied to finances, stolen company funds, and potential criminal liability. Though the sample was degraded, it contained enough genetic markers to strongly suggest it belonged to Emily. Phrases like being backed into a corner and erasing a mistake were pointed to as coded admissions of what had occurred. Instead, his team offered a closing argument focused on the tragedy of the situation and the danger of jumping to conclusions. They portrayed Mark as a devastated father whose grief had been twisted into a false narrative, but their words rang hollow against the weight of the evidence. There was no legitimate reason for her blood to be there, especially considering Mark's claim that she never re-entered the vehicle after leaving for prom. They described a father who valued his reputation more than his daughter's life. People who had once lit candles and shared posts in support of Mark now struggled to accept what he had done. Emily's funeral was finally held 5 years late. She wanted no more connection to the man she once called her husband. Her life would never return to normal, but at least now she had answers, even if they came at the cost of everything she thought she knew. Her remains were laid to rest in a quiet cemetery on the edge of town, beside a small memorial stone that had been placed there years earlier during the initial search efforts. It was a lesson in vigilance and listening closely to those we love, and in understanding that the darkest truths often hide in the most familiar places. The town would remember her not for the tragedy that took her, but for the spark she carried, brief, beautiful, and gone far too soon. Dozens of classmates, teachers, and neighbors attended. They brought flowers, letters, and tokens of remembrance. A man who chose deception over truth and murder over accountability. They asked the jury to see through the mask and deliver justice for Emily, a young woman who had gone to prom, full of hope, only to be silenced forever. If Susan found out, Mark's entire life would unravel. Emily had been angry, defiant, and seemed terrified afterward. The foreperson read the verdict, guilty on all counts. Mark Dawson was convicted of first-degree murder, obstruction of justice, and tampering with evidence. Susan broke down in tears, quietly sobbing into a tissue as reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. Mark showed no emotion. He simply stared ahead, expressionless, as the sentence was handed down, life in prison without the possibility of parole. Susan also described Mark's behavior after Emily's disappearance, how he always insisted on being the one to talk to. Police, how he kept certain parts of the house locked, and how she had once caught him burning old papers in the fireplace late at night weeks after their daughter vanished. He paid in cash. None of these items were ever reported or handed over when his daughter went missing. The implication was clear: he had been preparing for something. Whatever secret she uncovered had scared him enough to orchestrate her murder and burial, all while playing the role of a broken father to the outside world. They tried to suggest that someone else could have taken Emily after Tyler dropped her off. They even hinted at the possibility that Tyler may have had second thoughts about the party and done something violent in a moment of panic. Mark Dawson entered the courtroom in handcuffs, dressed in a plain gray suit, his expression unreadable. Multiple witnesses had seen him at the party, and time-stamped photos placed him in the house during the key window when Emily was presumed to be driven to the forest. There was no physical evidence linking him to the burial site. The defense's attempts to poke holes did little to sway the jury. No longer the sorrowful father begging for help on news cameras, he now sat as the accused killer of his own daughter. The prosecution opened with a clear message. This was not a crime of passion, nor was it a tragic accident. They presented the evidence in layers. First, the locket, a small piece of jewelry found hidden in Mark's garage. It had been on Emily the night she vanished, but was not recovered with her body. The locket tied her to the house after she was supposedly dropped off at the gas station. Then came the soil samples from the wheel wells of Mark's truck. The rare mineral match between that soil and the forest floor at Muscatatuck made it nearly impossible to explain away. The digital trail was next. Cell tower pings from his phone placed him near the wildlife refuge at the precise window of time when Emily disappeared. The court heard how his phone was turned off shortly after the ping, an intentional effort, prosecutors said, to avoid being tracked. The jury was then shown the security footage from the hardware store. Next came the testimony from Susan Dawson. Sitting alone in the witness stand, she appeared shaken but composed. Then came a bombshell. The prosecution introduced evidence from Mark's private laptop emails, encrypted messages, and documents. They detailed a secret online life. This was the motive. The defense struggled to offer a convincing alternative. Their strategy was to suggest that the evidence was circumstantial, that coincidences and misinterpretations had painted the wrong picture. But Tyler's alibi remained strong. One particularly damaging moment for the defense came when forensic analysts testified about the blood evidence found in Mark's truck bed. A psychologist also testified for the prosecution. He reviewed Mark's journal entries, the ones found in the locked drawer, and described them as signs of mounting pressure, guilt, and premeditation. Mark never took the stand. His silence left many wondering what the truth was in his own words, but his lawyers advised against the risk of cross-examination. The prosecution closed with a statement that left the courtroom silent. The jury deliberated for only 6 hours. When they returned, the courtroom held its breath. In the aftermath, the town of Greenwood was left with a mix of sorrow, betrayal, and disbelief. Susan moved away shortly after the trial ended. She sold the house and changed her last name. Emily's story became a symbol, not just of a lost child, but of how secrets can destroy even the most loving homes. The years following Mark Dawson's conviction were marked by a quiet sadness that never fully left Greenwood. Though justice had been served in the eyes of the court, there was no real peace, no final sense of closure. Emily Dawson's name still echoed in conversations in classrooms, and in the hearts of the people who had watched the entire nightmare unfold from a distance. No one in the neighborhood wanted to live in the place where such tragedy had occurred. Teachers remembered her as curious and kind, and her classmates, now adults scattered across the country, still shared her story in hushed tones. He was placed in protective custody after news of his crime spread quickly among inmates. Child-related cases often earn the most violent reputations inside prison walls, and even other convicts had their limits. Mark spent his days isolated, reading old novels and writing in a new journal. He never spoke about the murder. Not to cellmates, not to guards, not even during mandatory psychological evaluations. But after reading a retrospective article about the case, she realized the significance of what she had been told. Her statement helped solidify the prosecution's theory of motive, not just emotional or familial, but criminal. Mark hadn't killed Emily out of rage or panic. He had made a cold, deliberate choice to protect his lies, his theft, and the life he had built on secrets. He simply referred to the case as the incident, offering no further explanation. The case became an example of how even the most picture-perfect families could conceal dangerous truths. A small plaque was installed in a local park in Emily's name, surrounded by spring flowers and a bench where people could sit quietly and remember her. On the anniversary of her disappearance each year, candles appeared at the park's edge. No speeches, no banners, just light in the darkness. Experts discussed the red flags, the manipulation, and the psychology of someone who could maintain the illusion of grief while hiding the role they played in the tragedy. She placed a folded letter beneath the plaque, weighed down with a smooth stone. She never returned. Emily's photo, young, bright-eyed, forever frozen in time, became a symbol of more than just one crime. It was about the illusion of safety in a familiar home. It was about betrayal wearing the face of a parent. Her story would not be forgotten, not because of the horror, but because of the resilience it inspired in others. Because for every unspoken fear, for every overlooked warning, there was now a voice behind it, a reminder that truth has a way of surfacing, even when buried deep in the woods. It became a call to look deeper, to question assumptions, and to never underestimate the power of silence. A man who had once controlled the narrative so tightly now lived in silence, haunted by the very truth he tried to bury. Some admitted feeling guilt for not seeing the warning signs, for not pressing her to open up about what she was going through in the days before prom. Prosecutors who had children of their own found it difficult to separate the facts from the emotions. Detectives who had followed dead-end leads for years reflected often on the moment they finally unearthed the truth. She was in her late 30s and had worked briefly with Mark at the dealership years before Emily's disappearance. She claimed that during a private conversation, Mark had implied his daughter had discovered a personal scandal, specifically that he had been forging company financial records to funnel money into a separate account. Emily, who had always been good with computers and had helped him once with a spreadsheet, had stumbled upon suspicious files on his laptop. When she confronted him, he dismissed her, but according to the woman, Mark had confided that he feared his smart little girl could ruin everything. The discovery of Emily's remains had been the turning point, but it was the trail of small clues, the overlooked details and circumstantial evidence that had truly led them to justice. Others simply felt helpless, knowing nothing they could have done would have stopped what happened. The bank eventually repossessed it, and after months of renovations, it was finally purchased by a young couple unaware of its past. The new owners painted over the walls, landscaped the yard, and brought in new furniture. Still, longtime residents couldn't walk past it without remembering Emily in her blue gown, standing in the driveway, waving goodbye for the last time. Her story had imprinted itself onto the community, her smiling prom photos, now symbols of innocence, lost to a darkness few could have imagined. For Susan Dawson, life became a series of painful reinventions. She moved out of Indiana just months after the sentencing, settling in a small coastal town in Maine under her maiden name. She took a part-time job at a local bookstore and rarely spoke to neighbors. When asked about her past, she kept her answers short. never revealing the name that had once drawn headlines across the country. But in private, she continued to write letters to her daughter pages filled with apologies, memories and moments they never got to share. She never mailed them. Instead, she kept them in a box, locked away in her closet where no one else would read them. The house on Evergreen Drive, where the Dawson family had once lived, sat empty for over a year. The local school district quietly added a memorial page to the Greenwood Central High School yearbook, honoring Emily and the legacy she left behind. Meanwhile, Mark Dawson began his life sentence at the Indiana State Prison. The prosecution team, though satisfied with the verdict, struggled with the emotional toll of the case. And then came the part of the story no one expected. In early 2024, nearly a year after Mark's conviction, a woman came forward with information that sent ripples through the entire case. The woman had stayed silent out of fear, unsure if the comment had been serious. The story eventually reached national media once again. Documentaries, podcasts, and true crime channels explored every angle. In Greenwood, the town slowly moved on. Time dulled the sharpness of the wound, but it never fully healed. Susan visited the park once in secret. She wore sunglasses and a hooded coat, staying only a few minutes before leaving unnoticed. The final chapter of Emily Dawson's story wasn't just about the crime. It was about how lives are torn apart by the decisions of one person.